Hey there, everybody. Welcome to our second annual Trade Deadline podcast video show covering all the divisions in hockey. We've got a handful of days left before the NHL Trade Deadline comes on Monday, and we're going to take things division by division. We're going to start things off with the Atlantic Division. We've got some writers here, contributors from the Hockey Writers covering Montreal. We've got somebody here from Toronto. We'll take a look at the whole division as a whole, kind of let everybody know what's going on. So I'm just going to sort of walk around. We've got two covering here from Montreal. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, talk about what you might be working on, and then we'll kind of have a brief discussion about the whole division. Trege, I'll start with you. Let everybody know who you are, where they can find you, where they can follow your work, and what you're working on right now.
Treg Wilson. I'm Treg Wilson _THW on Twitter. I write for the Hockey Writers. I'm also co-host of Habs Unfiltered with my partner down there, Blain Potvin. And right now I'm working on an article. Kent Hughes, the GM for the Montreal Canadiens, at a presser today, basically pretty much outlined his plan for the trade deadline. So he came up and they asked him a bunch of questions about Carey Price, about who might be next, who's on the block. And he pretty much said that he's not sure about Price's future, but he is not in the market to acquire another goaltender. Jake Allen's back and healthy. He'll be playing tonight against Dallas. So they have Montembeault and Hammond on IR, but so they're pretty happy with the way the goaltending is, at least for the rest of the year, depending on how Price is going to be, I guess, going into next season or the end of this year. He also mentioned, which was a surprise to me, that Brett Kulak will not be dealt. Or they have no plans to deal Brett Kulak is what he said. So take that with a grain of salt. I'm sure if the right price. Now that could go either way. Either Brett Kulak didn't get the offer they were looking for, isn't getting the offers that they want from Brett Kulak, or they plan on re-signing Brett Kulak for next season. They are going to be short right-handed defense going into next year, and Kulak can play both sides. So that's a possibility. And basically he just said anyone else is available for the right price. To me, I think Lekkonen's a guy that people are really calling upon. And if that's the case, and if the rumor of the first and the prospect is true, maybe a little too high for some teams for a bottom six player. But if you look at Blake Coleman or Blake Goodrow from last year, they both got first round players when they were traded. So, or first round draft picks when they were traded. So other than that, that's the article I'm working on. And that's kind of his little dip into what he might be doing for the rest of the trade deadline. They also have a few UFAs. Matthew Perreault just went through waivers, but he's also been talking to the GM about his future in Montreal. And now that he cleared, it could be easier for them to trade him. And then you also have Cedric Paquette down in Laval. And I think that's it, unless Blain got someone else that comes to mind. But I think that's it for the UFAs for Montreal.
Well, before we ask Blain to follow up on that, I'm going to ask you, just based on it, because from what I gathered from that press conference today, it sounds like there's a little bit a lack of activity. Maybe there's a lot of talk that maybe Montreal was going to be one of the bigger and busier teams this year selling, but it sounds like a lot of what we were expecting to happen out of Montreal might not happen. Does that surprise you based on the way that press conference went this morning?
No, not really, because I got a feeling a few weeks ago that I didn't think they'd be that busy at this trade deadline. Like the Foley went, like almost a month ago now. So it's almost like, and then Sherratt, we all knew Sherratt was going to get traded. That was no secret and no surprise. But I think the issue is Hughes and Gorton have a certain criteria of who they want back and what they want back. And if they're not going to get it, they're not going to make the move. They're just not going to make a trade to make a trade. I'm not surprised. I still think there might be a player or two moving, but it's not going to be as busy for Montreal as people had thought. You're absolutely right. Everyone thought at first Montreal would be trading left, right, and center, and everyone would be going. But I think it's going to be quite quiet from now on for the Montreal Canadiens.
So I'll ask you one quick question before we move on here and take 10, 15 seconds to answer. Were you surprised by the return for Ben Sherratt?
No, I thought they got exactly what they were looking for. They wanted the first round pick. I was surprised it was Florida. I'll tell you that. I thought he was going to go to the West Coast. I thought he was going to go to St. Louis or Calgary. The B-level prospect, I think, was in there because of the first round pick. If they were going to Calgary saying get Peltier, I don't think you would have saw a first round coming back. The force surprised me. I thought that was added bonus. But the new guy, Similac or whatever you say his name. Apparently he has NHL skating, and he's pretty good with the puck. He's good with his body. He's a bit lanky, but he looks like he's going to be not a bad bottom six player in the NHL. So I thought they got a good return for it.
I was a little surprised it was Florida too. I was not thinking it'd be Calgary just after the Toffoli stuff when we'd heard that he might go in that deal. Then it didn't really happen because the ask was too much. I just don't usually see teams revisiting trade talks and making those two things work out. So I wasn't really ever thinking Calgary would be in it. But I was a little surprised it was Florida, even though we all knew that they wanted to make a move, just that they gave up so much and were willing to do the deal. So, Blain, what about you? I mean, you can follow up a little bit on Montreal here. What are you hearing? What are you do you expect anything else to happen here for the Canadians?
Yeah, like Trege. I mean, I watched the press conference as well, and in both French and English, Hughes made it very clear he has set prices. He's assessed what he has, and he is not going to sell just for the sake of selling. Now, on Kulak, unless he is signed to a contract before the deadline, I feel like he's going to get moved. So if there's not an announcement that he's being signed, he's likely traded because they're not going to just let a guy walk away. It would be a waste of an asset. And that doesn't seem to be something that Hughes or Gorton would be open to doing. I've had a little bit of work. I've done a little bit of work on Lehkonen and what his value is based on, as mentioned by Trege, Gaudreau and Coleman. So that's the kind of expectation. If he's the next big piece that I would expect to move, if there's a big piece to move.
Yeah, no, I've heard that there's a lot of interest in Lehkonen from around the league, and it's just a matter of whether or not people are going to be able to pay or willing to pay the price to acquire him. Let me ask you this, Blain. Do you think that the strategy that Ken Hughes is taking and the speculation and rumors that he's probably going to hit this offseason and dip into the free agency market, does this really scream a retool more than it screams any sort of inclination at a rebuild?
Yeah, he mentioned it today. He's not doing a fire sale, so it's not a rebuild as people would expect it to be. It's more of a renovation. So being a player in the free agent market, he's going to have to move a few players out of the way. He's got to make some space on the salary cap, move Weber's contract out. I would expect Petrie to be moved in the summer around draft time. If he wants to be a player in the free agent market, he needs money. And without that movement, he will have no money.
Don't be surprised.
Sorry,
I was just going to say, don't be surprised if Weber's contract's not traded near the trade deadline either.
I was just going to ask that question. Yeah. Do you think if that's something, I could see Petrie being a summer deal. I know that we've heard Josh Anderson's name and Brendan Gallagher's name, and I can't imagine those things are all that serious. But if you're moving money out to go and get money to buy, maybe that's a player you have to, but that's not going to happen for the deadline. But I was wondering if you guys thought Weber's contract would be one of those things we should really watch for. And do you see a team really open to it? Like, would it be Arizona? Is that the natural fit there? So we think
right now, from Elliot Friedman recently is Arizona's kicking tires on that. So it would make sense if they did. They have the space under the cap now to take him on, and you have to have that amount of money to take on that contract. So it's not teams near the cap ceiling that would be able to do it. Arizona could do it. And it would make sense for them, seeing as how they're moving into an arena that's smaller than my beer league arena. And they're going to need to hit the cap floor some way without spending the money. So they make sense.
Yeah. Arizona is always in that conversation when it comes to trying to get some money that it's on the books, but not, on the ice, usually, so to speak. Right. Let's switch gears a little bit. Peter's with us too. He covers the Toronto Maple Leafs. A couple other tidbits for some other teams when he does his podcast. But Peter, go ahead and introduce yourself. Let everybody know where they can find you and what you're working on right now.
Yeah, so you can find me at PBARACCHINI on Twitter. And I did do quite a bit of, pre-scouting or pre-trade deadline talks before about how, a certain name like Travis Dermott could be made for available where there's a prospect of like money out to get more assets in. His contract's up for another year, I believe. Still valuable and a young defenseman that, teams could look at. I also looked at because there are so many, possibilities with the Maple Leafs. They also try to acquire maybe a top 6 forward. I've gone maybe the third time to Connor Garland. I wrote last year how the Maple Leafs were kicking tires around him at the deadline. They went with Nick Foligno, and then they addressed it again in the offseason. So I thought maybe Connor Garland would probably be on their radar this time around. And of course, there was a whole issue at the beginning of the season with the right-handed defense situation. They went out, they got Ilya Lyubushkin from the Arizona Coyotes, where they traded away Nick Ritchie's contract again, a team that just wanted to try and accrue money and assets for the future. And it's working out well for both sides. Nick Ritchie starting to score. Lyubushkin is, being a very solid two-way kind of player for the Maple Leafs at this point, getting some top-line minutes recently with Morgan Riley. And yeah, that's basically what I've worked on in the past, and obviously working on the coverage when news breaks on Monday. So hopefully everything goes according to plan, because Hurdle signed. Wasn't really too happy about that, because I was hoping to have something written up on him. And now there's the prospect of Jacob Chychrun not moving as well because of the high price. So it's looking to be a very eventful, trade deadline for the next few days.
Okay, so let me ask you two questions, and one of them is sort of related to this Montreal conversation about how maybe inactive they might be. Mm-hmm. What about Toronto? Now, everybody thinks Toronto's going to be active all the time. That's just the way that the talk goes. The conversation tends to surround Toronto in a lot of these things. But there's also some talk that they might not do anything, that they have very little cap space in which to work. Well, now they might be the one team in the NHL who can work that salary cap better than anybody else. Yeah. But do you think that Toronto does a lot, or do you think they do way less than people are expecting that they might do before Monday?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because, they're looking to try and improve in all three situations. The goaltending most recently came into question with the play of Jack Campbell, but then his rib injury, Peter Mrazek, hasn't lived up to expectations with his $3.8 million. So on top of wanting to add defense, a top six forward, they now got to worry about goaltending and how they're going to address this situation. So, I mean, they are rumored in for quite a few names. I mean, Mark Giordano comes to mind. I know that Hampus Lindholm from the Anaheim Ducks are at the top of their list as well. But given the recent asking price for Lindholm, which is, a top prospect, a first, and another asset going to Anaheim, don't think the Maple Leafs are willing to make that kind of commitment, especially for rental, and especially if they're trying to sign him long term. I don't know if even that's going to be possible, because we all saw what happened with Nick Foligno last year. Kyle Dubas maybe wants to try and make a deal, but at the same time, he's very reserved at how far he's going to go. We mentioned how much he loves players with term, especially with a cheap contract. And, given the fact that Giordano is at the top of their list right now, it does kind of make sense. Obviously, their team that can work around the cap, try and find a third team in to try and retain salary on Giordano's contract as well. It's because that there's so many needs right now for the Maple Leafs that we didn't think that it would come up to this point, especially with goaltending. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And I think if they make one move, I think everything will fall into place. And I think that all rests on if Erik Källgren recently can, stop the bleeding with the goaltending in the backup situation. And if he plays well during the stretch in the short term, maybe that makes Peter Mrazek expendable. You can move that contract out, and then it opens up room for more moves in the future.
Well, that's super short term, because he's played one game. Right?
Yeah, very.
At this point,
very
how do you really
sample.
know what this guy's going to be able to do?
Yeah.
Like, he had a fantastic game, I'll tell you that much. But man, I wouldn't want to be making any major decisions based on one hockey game. So it'll be very interesting. So I have one more question for you, though. If they can only do one thing, so if Toronto has one move, and there's a lot of talk about that priority, what it is between the goaltending situation, the defense, and adding another forward, what do you think they focus on, if they focus on only one thing?
I think they're leaning more towards defense. I mean, we saw with all the names that they're linked to, and even before then, there were also talks about possibly Josh Manson, but he was on their no trade list. Calvin DeHaan has come up. We saw what they did with Lyubushkin to shore up that right-hand side. But if they were going for a left-handed defenseman, I think, Giordano is going to be at the top of their list. The goaltending situation is really tough, because there's only one or two big names. Maybe if you want to throw in Braden Holtby, but Marc-Andre Fleury is going to be the prize. And it's going to be really difficult, especially if you're the Maple Leafs, to try and bring in that contract or have Chicago eat salary. It's going to be a big price to pay. And again, Kyle Dubas is going to be very wary about that for rental players. I think that if you could shore up your defense, it'll make life difficult for, Jack Campbell for when he returns. And we know we've seen him struggle, but he has shown to be a capable starter early on in the season where, the team wasn't that great in front of him, but he was playing extremely well in the crease. So if they're able to get one more body on the fence and solidify that and maybe not rely so much on youngsters like Rasmus Sandin or Timothy Liljegren, but maybe even move out a key piece like Travis Dermott to bring somebody else in, I think that's going to be what they're going to aim for come deadline day. And if they manage to get a top 6 forward instead, I think it's going to be priority B, but I think maybe defense is going to be up their alley. Maybe even, I know they're scouting Florida and Nashville today, and not Florida, Philadelphia and Nashville, sorry. Maybe they're linked to Justin Braun as well, another guy that can step up, be a solid stay-at-home guy, get in the lanes, block shots, but even have some ability to this game. So I think that's going to be up their alley.
Yeah, I could see Justin Braun being in that conversation. I know the Oilers are looking at him too. Okay, so Trege, I'll start with you as we round out this topic of conversation with the Atlantic Division. Is there another team that you're looking at? So outside of Montreal, is there a team in this division that you're watching for specifically to make some waves, to do something here before the deadline?
I think the Boston Bruins are going to try to make a few moves to solidify their playoff spot and maybe even try to leapfrog Toronto in the top 3. Boston was a team at the first year I thought would take a step backwards, and they kind of didn't. They kind of sputtered for a little bit, but then they hit their groove and came up. Swayman's and Allmark have been playing well in nets for them, but I think they really need to shore up their defense, and I think that's what they're going to do. I think they're going to go out and try to make some moves to tighten up and maybe get some secondary scoring to help out the Bergeron, Pasternak, and Marchand line. Other than that, I mean, Tampa Bay's Tampa Bay. They'll put Kucherov on IR and see how much money they can bring in after that. And I mean, Tampa Bay has the team already. I don't think they really need to move anything. Florida has made their moves. So yeah, I think Boston's the team to watch at trade deadline to see what they're going to do. And it's been pretty quiet about Boston too. You haven't really heard too many rumors about people going to Boston. So
yeah, I think they might be upset if this Jacob Chikrin thing is really not happening. They might be one of the teams that we're probably looking at them. And I don't know if Florida's done. I'm not sure. Like, I don't know if they got $1 million to spend, get another, but I just have a feeling that they're not done, but well, maybe not. Blain, I never asked you where people can follow you. So I'll get you to promote yourself first, and then I'll let you talk about what team you're looking at.
Okay. Blain Potvin on Twitter, Instagram. You can find me at Habs Unfiltered on TikTok. Habs Unfiltered as well. I co-host the podcast with Trege. So that's a full-time job, keeping him in line.
Well, with a shirt like that, how do you not know who the rowdy one in the room is, right?
Pretty much.
That's right. Go ahead. Which team are you looking at there?
Well, I think, like you mentioned, I don't think Florida's done. There's still quite a lot of chatter about them going after Claude Giroux. That might happen. If it does, they're my favorite for the division. If not, Boston is another, like Treg mentioned, I think they're going to be going for defense. And if they do leapfrog Toronto, I think that does a favor to Toronto, because if Toronto ends up as a wild card, they'll end up playing someone in the Metro more than likely. And that would be Carolina, and they match up well against them. They do not match up well against anybody else in their division, because all the other teams in the playoff spots in the Atlantic right now are too gritty. They're too tested, too experienced, and Toronto just doesn't have enough spine.
I think shots fired here, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna.
Oh, I agree. I do agree in the sense that, Toronto does play that high tempo, high offensive game. They don't have enough physicality except for what they brought in with Lyubushkin. I mean, we saw Matthews' temper start to flare and the emotions start to come out with the Heritage Classic. But other than that, yeah, you really don't have enough players to step up when they need to. And I know they have Wayne Simmons, but he really hasn't stepped up when they needed to. Jake Muzzin is injured, who can be a physical force. But yeah, the intensity does intensify in the playoffs. There's no doubt about that. And I think Toronto may be outmatched, but then again, the speed game has shown to be a factor for them this season at times. So will be interesting to see who will be the ideal matchup.
Okay, to close things off, Peter, is there a team you're watching? Is there somebody that you're looking at outside of Toronto?
Yeah, I'm looking, well, not really a playoff team, but I'm looking at the Detroit Red Wings. Given the fact that, they're slowly starting to fall in the standings after a really great start. We're seeing the play of, Mort Seider and Lucas Raymond being really great, but now they still need to prepare for the future. I mean, they still need to bring in assets. They're still in a rebuilding phase. Recently, it was just reported that they're trying to sit Nick Leddy. Maybe they got a deal in place for him. He's a valuable asset for them. He can bring in a really great return. And also, I saw rumors of like a price or the possibility of Tyler Bertuzzi moving. He can bring in a really great return. And again, I'm not sure about the whole COVID-19 vaccination situation with other teams, but if there's a team willing to take him on, I mean, he's still really gritty goal scoring forward that was still provided a lot of upside to the team's top six. So definitely going to bring in a first and a top prospect for them. So that's who I'm going to be looking at.
Yeah, Bertuzzi to me would be the guy who moves that was mentioned to be moved, but be the most surprising move of the deadline. I don't imagine that happens, but we shouldn't be shocked because it's out there, right?
Yeah.
So who knows? For me, the team to watch is probably Ottawa, only because Pierre Dorian mentioned that he wants his phone to ring. Like he publicly came out and said, no one's calling me. What's going on? So I think when he did that, he probably put everybody on notice like, hey guys, I'm like interested in doing something here. So for me, they'll be sellers obviously, but I do believe that they might be that surprise team that sort of sneaks in there and gets a little active when we're all kind of forgetting that they're over there, right? And that they're ready to do some business, and we'll see. That's going to do it for the Atlantic division though, guys. Thanks for Trege, Blain, Peter. I appreciate you guys coming on, talking about your division, talking about your teams. It'll be a very interesting deadline, and maybe we'll get the chance to chat after it's over, just to take a look at your teams and what they did. For everybody else, yeah, absolutely. For everybody else, the next one coming around the corner, we'll have another division right up after this. Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. We are now going to be focusing on the Central Division. We've got a handful of contributors with the Hockey Writers here to talk about that. We're going to let them introduce themselves, talk about their teams. We're going to cover Chicago, St. Louis, and Minnesota here, but I'm going to let them take care of what they're working on, introduce themselves, let them plug their own social media feeds, whatever they want to, and then we'll talk a little bit about the division as a whole. So we'll start with Brooke. Brooke, you're going to cover Chicago. So let you introduce yourself and where they can find you and read your stuff, and then we'll let you talk about what you're working on.
Yes. So my name is Brooke LoFerno, and I cover the Blackhawks, like you said. You can find me on Twitter. I'm most active on Twitter, so I put my username up on the Zoom screen for you guys all to see. And we also do a podcast, Blackhawks Banter, that is published on Tuesdays on YouTube. So you can find that on the Hockey Writers YouTube page, and that's where you can find all my stuff next to thehockeywriters.com, obviously, for my articles.
So what are you actively talking about when it comes to the Blackhawks and the trade deadline? Are you working on something? Have you been keeping an eye on something? Is there a player or two that we should all be paying attention to as Monday approaches here?
Something that keeps ringing in my mind is Calvin DeHaan. His name, defenseman Calvin DeHaan. He's been, it seems, in the trade rumors a lot the past, actually even the past year, but it seems like the last couple of days his name keeps popping around as a name that should be watched. And I'm also have my eye on Brandon Hagel. I have no clue what they're going to do with him. He's going to carry, I think, a lot of trade value, and I don't know if they're going to want to move him or not. So I have my eye on him for sure too. But those are the two big names, because Fleury, Marc-Andre Fleury to me is very 50-50. He could go, he could stay, but those two I think are kind of dark horses, Calvin DeHaan and Hagel, that need to be kept an eye on.
Well, Hagel and Fleury were the ones I wanted to specifically ask you about, because they're two very different situations, but somewhat similar in that I think Chicago is willing to move Fleury, but yes, Fleury is probably not necessarily eager to go anywhere. Could be because he's comfortable in Chicago, could be because he just wants to be choosy about where he goes and whether or not it's across the border or on a team that's going to win. So you said you're 50-50 on Fleury. Do you believe that at this point there's any shot at all he gets moved? Because we've heard about like Toronto and other teams really pressing to see if they can get him to change his mind and maybe make a move. Do you think he does, or do you think he stays put?
A couple weeks ago, I would have said for sure he's going to be moved. And now that we're getting closer to the deadline, I'm thinking he's not going anywhere. I feel like if he was going to be moved, he maybe would have been moved by now. I think we're cutting too close to the wire. And it seems like a lot of teams, according to Elliot Friedman, have kind of gone out of the Fleury race. So to me, actually, I'm thinking he might stay, which will be obviously a big talking point on trade deadline day.
Do you think there's any possibility at all he looks at an extension with Chicago for the offseason? Assuming he stays put, of course.
Yeah, if he stays put, maybe actually, because he talks very fondly of the Blackhawks, and I do think it's kind of more than the team itself. I obviously understand he's got a wife, he's got kids. It might run a lot deeper than hockey. If they enjoy it here, I think he would. So I actually do think there is a genuine possibility, considering he talks very fondly of the team and he seems to fit in pretty well. The team loves him, the city loves him. So we'll see.
Now with Brandon Hagel, my take on this whole situation from the outside looking in is that Chicago wants the sun, the moon, and the stars to move him. And why wouldn't you? This is a pretty decent player who should, to me, be part of their equation, whatever it is they choose to do, whether it's retool, rebuild, completely change everything over in Chicago based on the way things have gone in the last little while. He's part of that equation to me anyway. Now there's a lot of people still talking about whether or not he gets moved. So do you think Chicago would be better served to hang on to Brandon Hagel, or could they get such a nice return that it's almost impossible to go, you know what, we have to consider this and maybe we have to move him?
Do you know what? I go back and forth on this because I love Brandon Hagel myself, and I think he makes sense. Obviously, if you're going through a rebuild, you have to keep young players like that. But I'm also not opposed to seeing what people offer. Sometimes teams get desperate and they do offer, like you said, the sun, the moon, the stars, and they probably will for Hagel. So I'm definitely not opposed to listening. If I'm the general manager, I'm for sure listening because you never know what you can get about that. Yeah, like I said, I go back and forth, but I'm honestly leaning lately towards trading him. See what you can get out of him, especially if you can get a first round pick. That's the key for Hagel. And it seems like that's what teams are offering. And that to me is key. You can't not take a first round pick for someone like Hagel.
Yeah, well, we're starting to see as the deadline deals start to come in, because it was slow for a while, but now it's starting to move and there's some people going and those first round picks are already moving. And so if teams are willing to trade him and he can fetch you one, I could understand why they'd look at it. Right. Awesome. I appreciate that. Okay, Mariah, let's go over to you. You cover the Minnesota Wild. What is happening over there? So Bill Guerin's got a decent team. He's got lots that he can work with. But he's got an interesting year next year because of the cap situation that he's put himself in with those buyouts. Anything specific that we should watch for with the Wild?
It's a really hard question because honestly, earlier this week, I think is when it happened. I wasn't expecting them to trade anybody like at all. I was kind of expecting them to just sit. I had heard a lot of rumors about the goaltending, but I think they're just kind of in a bad spot right now. They'll be fine. I don't think they need to rush out and try to get a goalie or anything like that. I wasn't expecting Sturm to be gone, but I'm happy they got Jost and I'm excited to see how he does. Sturm's a good player. He just was really struggling with us, so maybe a change of scenery can be a really good thing for him. Other than that, I really don't expect them to do a lot.
Do you think they could be a sleeper team? Are they one of those teams that, we watch for? We know that they're going to be competitive. They're going to have, decent run at this, but and maybe need one or two pieces to really get themselves in the conversation. But could they be a sleeper team that goes out there and surprises us? Or do you think it's just too much of a risk, considering that they have to be very, very cautious about the money they spend?
I'm gonna say the cautious side. Just listening to Guerin, I've seen a few interviews with Guerin, and even like the biggest thing, like I said, the goaltending they were talking about, and just everyone's been pressuring him, and he's like, I believe in our guys. I think we're gonna be fine. So I really don't expect anything, especially with their money situation with Parise and Suter stuff, and it's just. I'm really glad I'm not him with the situation, but I mean, they have a good team. They just got to find their way again.
How do you think he's done as a GM so far? I mean, he's pretty gutsy. Like, this is a guy who has not been afraid to make interesting decisions. Like, I can't imagine a first-year GM buying those two guys out. Like, that's just pretty unheard of to me. But so what do you think of the job he's done so far?
To be honest, I love him. I've listened to his interviews a few times. I just love how he sees the team, and I know a lot of people are upset with him because Rossi isn't playing yet, but Boldy's been doing fantastic. And I think it's more of he kind of wants to wait and see with Rossi, and especially with that first year contract stuff that I'm still learning about, but I know Boldy had already burned his first year, so it didn't really matter at that point. But Rossi, I think, was still under the 10 games rule, whatever it is.
Right.
So I know a lot of people are upset about that, but I think it's kind of a wait and see, and we don't want to rush anything either. So I'm happy. I love him, and I'm looking forward to where this team's going to go.
I do want to ask you about Kevin Fiala, though. Here's a guy that a lot of people have talked about. He's been in and out of the rumor mill, maybe moves, maybe doesn't. He's a guy that could be expendable. We don't know what his contract situation is going to look like. And if the Minnesota Wild feel like maybe he's part of the long-term equation. I don't know if you guys can hear it, by the way. My chickens are yelling at me. What do you expect has happened with Fiala there?
Oh boy, I'm hoping they sign him because I mean he's at the beginning of the year. I was on the boat of okay, we need to get rid of him. He needs to go because he wasn't doing what was expected. But he surprised everyone. He had a really slow start, but since January, I believe he's been one of the top scorers on the team. He has like a whole new level to his game right now. I mean, he does still make mistakes more than I'd like, but I'm not in the NHL, so I can't complain too much, but I think he stays. I hope he stays. They'll find some way to keep him is my hope, but honestly, like I said, I really don't know with the cap space, what they're going to be able to do.
Sorry, guys. I was on mute there. I was trying to silence my chickens in the background. I don't know if you guys can hear them or not. Is it fair for me to say that don't expect too much from the Minnesota Wild during the deadline, but maybe expect some moves and some action over the offseason? Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
I would think so. I think that's where he would be Guerin would be most comfortable doing stuff. I don't think he wants to rock the boat too much with the team at this point.
Yeah, and why would you, I guess, right? Like they're playing pretty good hockey. So it's hard to you don't even when you are looking to make moves, you got to be cautious of what you bring in and what you send out and how that affects the team, stuff like that. All right, awesome. I appreciate it. Steven, we're gonna move on over to you and the St. Louis Blues. Let everybody know where they can find you if you're working on anything specific towards the trade deadline. What's going on in St. Louis?
Yeah. So most common place to see my tweets and stuff is at the podcast account, which is at 2guys1cup on Twitter. I've just written an article at the Hockey Writers talking about 3 kind of under the radar, unexpected moves the Blues could make. And then I'm planning a couple more this week, looking at kind of the new core of the team, because I think they've had a couple guys emerge as sort of untouchable players this year. And then also looking at the Ville Husso situation, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly in a little more detail. So those should be up in the next few days, I'm hoping.
Okay, well, let's do it. Let's talk about the Ville Husso situation. What is happening there? What is something that we all need to know for people that don't follow the St. Louis Blues as closely as you do or others in that area should in this division? What do we need to know about what's going on there?
Yeah, so it's a really fascinating situation. I'll try to boil it down as quick as I can. But essentially, Ville Husso, for those who don't know, was the long-term goalie of the future in St. Louis. For many years, he was looked at as the next big thing, kind of behind Jake Allen, hopefully his eventual successor at the position. And then Jordan Binnington, who'd been basically a write-off in the depths of the system, had his miraculous run. We don't need to cover that anymore, and kind of supplanted him as the long-term guy. But last season, Husso made his debut as Binnington's backup and looked pretty rough and in limited work. And then this year, he's more or less stolen the starting job, at least at the moment. He's been the number one guy. He's had phenomenal numbers. He had, a 2.0, sub 2.0 GAA for most of the season, and has looked really good. The only problem is he's an unrestricted free agent after the season. Jordan Binnington just signed a 6-year, $36 million contract extension last year. So now Doug Armstrong, Blues GM, is kind of between a rock and a hard place. Because, if he keeps Husso, who's going to obviously want a significant raise, then he's looking at one of the most expensive goalie tandems in the league. If he trades Husso, the way Binnington's been playing, he's, leaving him with a huge question mark going into the playoffs. So it's pretty interesting. And just a minute ago, someone sent me a tweet. Frank Saravalli has apparently reported that the Blues have shopped Binnington a little bit to some teams that have goalie issues, hoping to maybe convince them to take the contract of a former Stanley Cup winner. So a lot up in the air there and a lot of questions left to be answered.
Just going to ask you if you thought that maybe Binnington could be a guy, because there's a common phrase in the NHL that every team is looking for their next Binnington, right? The guy who comes out of nowhere, comes in, has a miraculous run, takes a team, carries them on his back. I mean, every team would love that, but that's pretty rare. It's unlikely that you're going to find that kind of player. So now they're looking at the free agent market or the trade market, and there's not a lot out there either. So if you're
Right.
St. Louis and you've got Jordan Binnington and you're willing to move Jordan Binnington, and maybe Binnington might be willing to go, could you see a trade before Monday where that happens?
Yeah, I mean, it will be so hard with that contract because it is $6 million a year. He's not performing well. Teams, even if teams were interested, not everybody has the cap room to do it right now. But it's certainly interesting to hear the report, and it's hard. I'm firmly of the belief that the goaltending position is, pretty much witch doctory. 90% of it. There's the few guys that truly are elite year after year, but everybody else is kind of in a roll of the dice, even under the best of circumstances. So I'm sure that they would love to, free themselves of the contract and have the flexibility to get Husso and probably get him a little cheaper and on shorter term, but I'm not convinced it's very likely that somebody's going to step in and take 5 years of a contract for a goalie who's not performing.
No, that makes sense. Money's always tight and you got to watch for it, of course. Anything you expect St. Louis to do here before Monday? Is there any kind of moves that we should be watching for?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big question mark all season, the big rumor has been left side of defense. They've got a pretty big hole there in their top four. Marco Scandella has completely fallen off. It was a bad decision to extend him when they did. And the Blues were heavily linked to Ben Sherratt until he moved this week. So there's still discussions of guys like Giordano, guys like Jacob Chikrin. I think, personally speaking, Giordano makes more sense because they, can bring him in for this season and kind of figure out what his contract, if they want to keep him, would be going forward. And, they've got some more flexibility there. Chikrin, if he moves, which I kind of don't expect, is going to cost a fortune. So, I don't know that the Blues really had the assets to swim in that water, but I would think it pretty likely that they make a move on defense before the deadline. As far as any other moves, I wouldn't write off the possibility of trading Husso, just because there are a lot of really good teams right now who seem desperate for a goaltending, and there aren't that many top level options, and kind of that same. Yeah, exactly. I wasn't going to say it, but
I got a team that knows about we could use a goaltender.
And they've been, Elliot Friedman's reported in the past that they're really high on Husso. So, I think it's kind of that similar to the Hagel situation we were talking about, as if somebody comes up and really does come with that first round pick offer or a really high level prospect, especially if you can improve on defense in the same fell swoop, then it's really something you have to look at, because you're probably not going to unload that Binnington contract, and you probably can't afford to pay $10 million for a goalie tandem next season either.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, only Montreal can do that, and we don't know that necessarily works too well.
Yeah, exactly.
Brooke, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to ask you if there's a team in the Central Division that you're watching, if there's somebody outside of Chicago that you're kind of keeping your eyes on. We talked a little bit about Minnesota and St. Louis, but Nashville could be a sleeper team that plays pretty well, that might make a move, but nobody's talking about them. Winnipeg could sell. Colorado's already been bit. Like, who are you sort of looking at?
I'm actually looking at the Predators. Of all the Central Division teams, it seems like the Blackhawks are comfortable making trades with the Preds for whatever reason. It's kind of odd to me, but they have been linked to Calvin DeHaan, and they've also been linked to Ryan Carpenter. So I do think there might be something there between the Hawks and the Preds, but in general, the Preds have been linked to a lot of people lately. And since Steven mentioned the Blues, something tells me there might be a Hawks connection there. If Fleury leaves, I could totally see something like that happening with either Husso or even Binnington. I don't even know if that even makes sense, but I see it. So I actually, the Preds and the Blues for sure is who I got my eye on. They could go plenty of different ways.
Yeah, it's pretty open. Other than Colorado that we know is actively buying, and Arizona that we know is actively selling, everybody in that middle ground there, we're not real sure what's going to go on. Mariah, what about you? Is there a team that you're keeping an eye on outside of the Wild? If they're not going to be that active, is there a team that you're sort of hoping either isn't active because of what it could mean for your team, or you think will be active?
Well, I would say Colorado, but we already made a trade with them. So, but otherwise, Winnipeg, if Winnipeg has had the Wild's number this year just completely, and I know in the last few years we've had to face them in playoffs, so I'm really hoping they don't make any big trades to get anybody else and the Wild can sneak by them if they would have to face them. So that would be my hopes.
There you go. That makes sense. What about you, Steven? Who are you looking at outside of St. Louis?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody has at least one eye on the Avalanche. They're obviously positioning themselves to make a big move, and there's a lot of talk about Giroux going there. Kind of how much better can they possibly get if you have to beat them to escape the division, presumably. But I'm also looking at the Dallas Stars. I think it's kind of interesting to see where they're at. They sort of made a run there for a minute, and now they've fallen off again, and it'll be interesting to me to see if they really do sell and kind of start a mini rebuild, or if they're kind of trying to hold their chips and wait for the summer. They'll be a fun one to watch.
Yeah, those teams that we don't really know where they sit, and I'm going to include Winnipeg in that, is the ones that intrigue me, because you don't know what they're going to do. And come Monday, they could be one of the busiest teams at the deadline day, because they've just all of a sudden woken up that morning and decided that they're sellers or that they're not, right? So it could be interesting. And that's why I want to watch Winnipeg too, right? Because I have a feeling this team has no idea what their identity is. And if that's the case, who knows what kind of chaos could come out of that. And for those that follow my stuff and the NHL rumors every day, I love chaos. Like, that's just the way that I operate. The more chaos, the better for me. So that's a team that I'm watching. The only person Mariah, I didn't give you a chance to let everybody know where they could follow you. So do you have a Twitter handle or anything like that you want to plug?
I did, just like Brooke. So mine's a little confusing. I go by Holland for everything, the Hockey Writers, but my Twitter is Stark. I got married in October, so my name's a whole thing, but it is up on the screen, and that's where I'm at. So
awesome. Well, for Brooke and Mariah and Steven, myself, Jim, thank you. I appreciate all of you coming on to talk about the Central Division. We're not done yet, though. We've got 2 more divisions to cover. We're going to do that right after the turn here. Welcome back, everybody. Okay, we've covered the Central. We've covered the Atlantic. We're now on to the Metro Division, and we've got 3 contributors here from the Hockey Writers to do all of this and talk with us about a number of teams in this division. Kristy's with us, Matt's with us, Mark's with us. I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves, plug whatever you want to plug. If it's your Twitter or Instagram or whatever you want to plug, I'm going to let you do that, and then talk about what you're working on. Hopefully some of it related to the trade deadline, because that is what this show is about. Kristy, I'll start with you. You cover the Devils. Let everybody know where they can find your stuff, and what are you working on? Are you talking about anything specific to the trade deadline right now?
Okay. As of right now, I am not. I do have a couple articles in the works, but I kind of back down a little bit from the trade deadline. You can find me on Twitter at @instalettos_NHL. It's always a good time. And yeah, I have a couple things in the work, background behind the scenes with MSG Networks, which does the broadcast for the Devils. So that's kind of exciting. And a couple players are coming back to the lineup. So stay tuned.
So let me ask you this. If you're not really focusing on the trade deadline a lot in your articles, is that because you're not a huge, you don't love I love the trade deadline. It's like,
I know you do.
It's like totally my jam, right? Like, I absolutely love trades and rumors and speculation, because if you follow my stuff, this is what I do. But so it is your preference more to not go near that stuff? Is that why? Or is there just not a lot of activity in New Jersey right now to talk about?
So I guess a little bit of both. I did a couple trade deadline profiles on players that could potentially be moved, but it's not, I don't know. I'm not really one that is really good on guessing returns and stuff like that. So I kind of just shy away from it a little bit and kind of stick to my knack of telling stories. But the Devils are an interesting team to watch at the trade deadline. I feel like there's not going to be a lot of movement, but they're a team that could potentially make a big splash if the right opportunity presents itself for our general manager.
Yeah, I've heard that Fitzgerald is not, he's selling, but he's not selling like a traditional seller might sell. Is that correct? Like, he's sort of really looking at who he picks up. He's not going near a ton of contracts. He's not thinking full on rebuild. He's got a young group of really talented potential stars in his roster, and he wants to accent that is the word I'm looking for. Is that an accurate read on the situation in New Jersey, you think?
I think that is accurate. I don't think I would technically label them as sellers. I think it's going to be kind of like a Blake Coleman situation where I don't think he's really actively shopping people. I know, Subban's not going to come back. So obviously if we can get something for him, that would be great. His contract's obviously a little bit of an issue, but I think it might be just like a Coleman where if the right situation presents itself where it can help the team in the long run, I think he's going to take it, but I don't think he's actively making calls to kind of dump players and contracts. It's a young team. We're on the right track. That's kind of where he is.
I was going to ask you about Subban because there's a guy that there's a lot of talk floating around about what could happen there. And they have said, we've seen reports that he's been told he's not going to be re-signed or extended. I don't know if that means at all that there's just no chance that he's coming back, but I'm assuming he's going to move on to do something else.
Yeah.
So do you expect that they are trying to actively trade him, or are they just at a point now where they're kind of like, we don't think we can, he's going to walk, we're okay that he does. What do you think happens with him before Monday, if anything?
I think Fitzgerald said he might put some calls into teams to see what they need, but I think he also realizes that if Subban is going to be moved, obviously we're going to have to retain some money there. But yeah, other than that, he is going to walk, I think, at free agency because the team is not going to re-sign him. So if you can get something for him, that would be great. I'm just not sure where the best fit would be for him for this situation. It would need to be a team that would just need a depth piece, but not. It would be a depth piece is really what it would come down to. So it would be interesting to see where he would potentially fit in.
If we put aside the money factor, do you think there is a team that would look at him and say, based on the way that he's played the last couple of seasons, that he could be somebody that could help them in a playoff run?
On the ice, I'm actually going to say Boston kind of intrigues me a little bit because they definitely need help on the blue line. So that's a little intriguing. And the fact that they're already aging, they wouldn't really have to commit to Subban long term. So it would kind of just be a rental to see what he can do. Montreal fans wouldn't be too happy with that, but that's kind of the team that jumps out. I mean, I guess Calgary too would be an interesting, because I know they're looking for a depth defenseman as well, but it would be a shame for them not to bring back Giordano at that point.
Yeah, well, we've heard, and we'll talk about this in our Pacific Division chatter a little bit, that Sean Monahan's name is out there too, just to clear some money, right? To see if maybe they can make another move here, because they are a team that wants to get active here. That's an interesting situation in New Jersey. I'm looking forward to seeing what they do. Do you believe that they're going to be less active now, but more active in the offseason? Is that your expectation here?
Yes, I think the main focus for the Devils right now is goaltending. I think anything else would just kind of be icing on top of the cake. Right now, I think their main focus is goaltending.
Cool. Okay, perfect. Excellent rundown to start things off. Matt, I'm going to move over to you. You cover the Rangers, also the Devils a little bit, so you're welcome to add anything to that topic of Devils conversation. But what are you thinking? Where can people find you? What are you working on? Anything specific to the Rangers and the deadline?
You can follow me on Twitter at Grazel. I had an article published today on what the Rangers have in Alexander Grigoriev, the backup. That three teams, the Oilers, Maple Leafs, and the Golden Knights could use him based on their either inconsistencies in goaltending, which is what I've been reading with Edmonton. It's been their issue, or with Toronto and Vegas, it's more an issue of they're dealing with injuries at the position. So
yeah, I can speak to the Oilers. You know, I know well our goaltending situation. Yeah, Smith's been hit or miss, injuries and illnesses. He's back in tonight. He's going to be playing against Buffalo, so we'll see how that one goes. But there's certainly some question marks there. It's just about money. And Georgiev is the name that has popped up when it comes to the Oilers. I don't know how realistic the option is in terms of a trade, whether or not they're looking at that on a more long-term basis, if they were to make that kind of a move, or if they're thinking just let's get us into a rental. We'll take a look at something during the summer. I'm not really sure. But the Rangers have been a team that a lot of people have talked about because they are actively willing to spend some money and are looking to, they're one of the few teams to me that has a good team, a good shot at this, cap space in which to work with. Do you believe the Rangers, because they haven't been active so far, it's Colorado and it's been Florida, it hasn't really been the Rangers yet, which is surprising a lot of people. Do you think something coming here? Is there something happening, impending or imminent for the Rangers before Monday?
Given that some of the rumored targets they were, there's speculation to be interested in, Ben Sherratt, the defenseman, and Kelly Jornik, they both were traded. So that's two players who have gone elsewhere. I think it depends. From what I was reading, the Anaheim Ducks, they're for Rickard Reichel. The Ducks won a first-round pick for him, so which is kind of high at the deadline. I mean, it's understandable they want to. If the price is really high, you kind of want to get maybe more than you can for a certain player. But I think the Rangers might back off a bit if that's the case. And they might concentrate on adding more to their bottom six. They traded for the Frank Bacciaroni from Florida. So that was a minor move. So right now I would expect more of the same kind of moves like that. Nothing really to add to the top six or they could still add a bottom six defenseman, the Seattle Kraken defenseman Mark Giordano. He's been rumored. He's still a possibility. I did read that he's a Toronto native and he's hoping to go back there. He has a no movement clause, so he kind of gets somewhat of a say into where he wants to go. But so at this point, I would expect only minor moves at the deadline if the Rangers make any.
I'm really kind of intrigued by that team because they're a decent team. They've been in on a lot of conversations. JT Miller was one of them. And then eventually it sounds like JT Miller's not leaving Vancouver, or they're not willing to move him at this point, and they'd be more apt to maybe trade someone like Brock Besser. But we don't really know what's happening in Vancouver. I'm sure we'll talk about that in the Pacific Division too. But the Rangers are going to be a very interesting team to watch. I have a feeling that maybe we'll hear a lot about them over the next few days. Whether they actually make a bunch of moves or not, I don't know. But we're going to hear a lot. We're going to hear them in the background, I think, for a lot of the conversation about some of these bigger names. Mark, I'm going to move over to you. You cover the Columbus Blue Jackets. Let people know where they can find you. If you're working on anything specific, what do you expect to see from the Blue Jackets here?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Mark Scheig. Working on quite a few things for the deadline. I'll actually be at Nationwide Arena on Monday. The Blue Jackets have a practice at 11 o'clock. No game, but obviously with the trade deadline, we're going to be closely monitoring their situation where they've got 3 guys that I think could easily go. And then depending on if other situations come up, they could have others. The big chip is going to be Max Domi, and that's somebody who has played a lot better as of late. His tenure in Columbus since being acquired from the Josh Anderson deal, he's been very inconsistent. And a pending UFA, it doesn't sound like they want to re-sign him. So they want to try to get as much as they can. Seen some reports out there, the Capitals. I could even see a team like Colorado. I could even see a team like Boston be interested in someone who could be a really important depth piece, someone who can add speed to the lineup, someone who can add offense to the lineup. It's not often you can trade for a former 70-point scorer to add to a contender. So there is some appeal there. And even more appealing is the Blue Jackets have all kinds of cap space. So they could act as a third-party broker. They can hold back some of that money and maybe get a little bit of a nicer return, maybe get an upgrade in a prospect. But that's going to be the biggest chip to watch. A couple other names I think are going to be interesting. Dean Kukin is a UFA defenseman who can add depth. I think actually would be a good piece for your Oilers, Jim.
Yeah, I heard that today.
Yeah, I actually wrote about that in February, that I thought he'd be a good fit in Edmonton just because he can play the role of a depth bottom pair defenseman, but can also act as a 7 or 8 as injury insurance, and maybe even cost him like a 6th-round pick, if not maybe even a little bit less. It wouldn't cost much at all. Then the other name we're watching, they're playing the Capitals tonight, is Jonas Korpisalo, the goaltender, who's not had the year he's wanted. Just 6 wins all year. Just hasn't been able to find his footing. He's not the number 1 goaltender anymore. Elvis Merzlikins can show there. But I wonder if the Vegas Golden Knights, now with the situation with Robin Lehner and his knee injury, are they going to try to go into these playoffs with Brossoit and Thompson in goal? You think they have to be looking. And if they don't want to pay a high premium price, Korpisalo, he's won in the playoffs before. Had that tremendous game against Tampa back a couple years ago where he had 80 some odd saves. So question is, can he get that form back? And a lot of teams aren't convinced of it, but there's certainly opportunity there. So that'll definitely be worth watching.
I was going to ask you if you had any sort of read on what you thought other teams might view of some of these guys. Like Max Domi is a really interesting player. When he's effective, he's really effective.
Yes.
And I could see him fitting in Boston. Like that screams the type of team that he would excel on, right?
Absolutely.
Korpisalo had that really good run in the playoffs, but then there's this kind of take now that maybe he's not a starter, that we don't know what he is. And that I even know the Oilers were rumored to have looked at him at one point. Do you get a sense of what some of these other teams are thinking when it comes to the Blue Jackets players? Like, are these assets that are coveted that people really want, or they're more like plan B, plan C type of players?
Well, I think Domi would be a plan B. I think he's kind of not in the tier underneath some of the top names out there. It won't take a 1st-round pick to get him. You could probably get him, say, 2nd, 3rd-round pick, maybe even throw a condition in there. But that's their biggest trade chip right now would be him, just because of everything he brings to the table. Korpisalo is interesting because there are some teams that I think believe that he can still be the goalie from a couple years ago. You got to remember something about Columbus. They give up the most shots in the league. They also give up the most goals in the league. So it's fair to say that he has not had the defense whatsoever in front of him. Put him on a good team like Vegas when they're healthy. Let's see what it is then. That's why I think teams can get him maybe even for a mid to late round pick. I mean, teams aren't going to throw a first or second round pick at somebody who hasn't had good numbers in a couple years. Now, and that's the question they have to answer. He's a former all-star goaltender. Can he get back to that point? And then would he be an upgrade to somebody? And that's the interesting part about Vegas. Who would you rather have? Would you rather have Brossoit starting if Lehner's not coming back? Or would you rather have someone in Korpisalo who's been in that fight before? The other thing that I think doesn't get enough play with him, he's been a number one goaltender for the last couple of years. He's lost that. So he hasn't played very much. And in fact, as I'm speaking right now, he gave up another goal and Elvis Merzlikins is going into the game down 3-0 to Washington. So there actually is a chance that the Blue Jackets could elect to keep him too. So that could go any number of ways, but it won't cost much at all to acquire him.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit on you. What's the story with Patrik Laine? Here's a guy that we've heard out there, and then we heard is no longer out there because he's played fantastic this season. He had a rebound year. He had some personal stuff that he was dealing with, which obviously affected his season and things like that. What's the story with him? Is he absolutely off the market? He's not going anywhere prior to the deadline. And do you believe that he's probably going to extend here with Columbus?
So I'll say to that, what is the next question? Because there is no conversation to be had with this. He is off the market. He wants to stay in Columbus. Kekalainen's on record as being interested in wanting him to stay in Columbus. The thing they're going to try and figure out is what is the appropriate term and what is the appropriate dollars. But as for any rumors, in fact, he was actually really upset to hear that rumors were out there, vehemently denied all of them. Time to move on to the next conversation when it comes to Patrik Laine.
Good.
Now.
Well, at least we could put that to rest then, right? We can solidly say we can drop the topic of Patrik Laine because if the only point that we have to talk about anything is what that number is going to look like.
Yep.
So that's good. That's fantastic news.
Indeed.
All right, Kristy, I'm going to come back to you. Is there a team in this division outside of your own team, New Jersey, that you're kind of watching, think might be a player, might make some moves, will be intriguing over the next few days here?
I'm going to say Carolina. I think Carolina is kind of intriguing. And just for the fact that my team desperately needs a goaltender, I'm also keeping an eye on what's going to happen with Georgiev. I'm curious if they're going to keep him or if they're going to move him around and where he's going to go to. But yeah, Carolina to me is an intriguing team come the postseason.
Carolina is one of those teams that seems to be in every single conversation. Like you hear about Don Waddell sort of lurking in the background on everything, but you don't know if they're actually going to make any moves. They're a really, really solid team. And you know that they want to be in the conversation because they don't want any teams around them doing anything when they don't do anything, but they're pretty good. So I don't know that they need to make a bunch of changes. I'm not sure who you would even move off their roster. It may say maybe Vincent Trocheck, but even then, he's just in all the conversations. I'm just curious to see if he does anything. Matt, what about you? Is there a team outside of the Rangers or the Devils that you're kind of keeping an eye on here in this division?
I think what Philadelphia ends up doing is going to be interesting based on they've been rumored to be sellers for the last couple for quite a while. And just to see where Claude Giroux goes, if he ends up going anywhere. There's been at least 5 guys who've been rumored to go to different places throughout that team. So that should be interesting to keep an eye on. I think Washington will be interesting as well, just because I'm not certain if they're sold on their if they're heading to the playoffs, if they're satisfied with their goaltending situation. They always seem to be in the market for a good goaltender, especially if they got rid of Holtby or Holtby left. It doesn't seem to be a solid number one with that franchise.
Yeah, it will be interesting. Maybe Mark will have more clarification on whether Korpisalo is on Washington's radar at all. But Philadelphia, their name has come up in a number of the divisions that we've covered already. Justin Braun is out there for a few teams, and there's some players there that could get on the move. And as we are watching, as you mentioned, Claude Giroux is the big name here to kind of keep an eye on. Mark, what about you? Any teams that you're actively kind of like, I wonder what they're going to do out of this division?
Yeah, there's three, and Matt just got done mentioning Washington. I think Vanacek's played really, really well as of late. So that's now all of a sudden an interesting decision. Do they trust Vanacek to go into the playoffs like this, knowing that the Caps are only going to have a couple more shots at this thing? Or do they, make the big splash, maybe try to acquire a Marc-Andre Fleury? I don't think Fleury would ultimately go to the Capitals if he wants to end up back with the Penguins at some point. I think they need help. They could use a depth piece. They can also have to make a decision on the goaltending. So that's one. The Islanders are another one. Zdeno Chara. I mean, do you feel like the Islanders? I wonder if he would honestly go. It'd be storybook stuff if it end up being back in Boston somehow. But that would be one guy. Zach Parise. I know there's some stuff out there about him. Does he want to come back to the Islanders next year? I think he does, but there's still a couple guys that they have to make decisions on. And the Penguins too. They're obviously all in. Malkin and Crosby are doing their thing again. But Kasperi Kapanen is somebody who has struggled vastly on that team, and they could certainly use another winger, I believe, to play on Malkin's line. So are they able to acquire a top six forward to be able to add to that group? I think Hextall might be looking in that direction. So there's definitely something interesting going on in the Metro all the time, especially given the Capitals are pretty much looking to win the Cup, the Penguins, the Carolina Hurricanes. That is a tough division. We haven't even gone to the Rangers yet, and Shesterkin can steal a series or two. So no shortage.
There's a lot of teams in this division that are on that what are we going to do next year conversation. Like if we don't do it this year, when's the next shot we're going to get at this thing? Like Pittsburgh's in that conversation. Washington's in that conversation. There's a lot of teams that have some aging players that, this window is shortening and rather quickly. So it'll be interesting. I'm with you. If Kapanen moves out of Pittsburgh, expect Pittsburgh to do something, like if they can shake that money, I expect them to do something. I think Philly's going to sell. I don't know what's going on with Washington. I'm not sure if they're comfortable with their goaltending or not, but Oilers are in that same situation. There's a lot of teams in that situation where they're just like, we don't know if we can trust our goaltending, but what are you going to do? There's only so many goaltenders available, right? So yeah, it's going to be a very interesting few days because it hasn't been busy yet, but it could pick up, and maybe the Metro is going to be one of those divisions where a lot of action happens.
Yep.
Awesome, guys. I'm going to let you go. I appreciate you coming on to talk about your division. Kristy, Matt, Mark, thank you for doing that. If we get the chance, probably after the deadline is over, we get an opportunity to talk about what your teams did. I'd love to have you guys back on to chat about that.
Thank you.
Sure, Jim, appreciate the time.
Awesome, guys. Okay, we got one more division after this. We're going to cover the Pacific Division coming up next, right around the turn. Welcome back, everybody. We are on to our fourth and final division here in the NHL and the NHL Trade Deadline for 2022. We're talking Pacific Division, and we've got a handful of contributors from the Hockey Writers with us to do so. We've got Austin, we've got Victor, we've got Matthew. I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves, talk about what they're working on, what's happening with their respective team towards the trade deadline, and then plug their social media or whatever they want to plug. Matthew, we're going to start with you. You're up in my left-hand corner, so it makes the most sense. I don't know what other people are seeing, but for me, you're right there. So we're going to start with you. Vancouver, lots of talk about this team. Not much action around this team. Could be because they're in a playoff position now, potentially. Could be because there was just a lot of talk that never turned into anything, and sometimes that happens. What's going on in Vancouver? What are you working on? Where can people find your stuff? What's happening there?
Well, there's really not a lot of talk lately, but that's because the Canucks are pulling out of the playoffs. They could be in the playoffs for the end of the night today, depending on where Vegas falls. But you can follow me on Twitter at Matthew Zator SC. Also do a lot of writing on the Hockey Writers. I host the Prospect Corner YouTube show as well. So I do a lot of prospects coverage and the draft. But yeah, the Canucks are an interesting situation. I think with their close to the playoffs, they got some contracts that are big contracts that are probably not easy to move, like Tyler Myers. There's been talk about him. Connor Garland has been in the rumors. Brock Besser, JT Miller, not so much now because he's got career high now, 73 points. So he's going to be probably a guy that's going to be re-signed rather than traded. So, but yeah, the Canucks are going to be interesting to see what they do. I feel they're not going to do anything apart from maybe some small deals, like maybe getting rid of Jason Dickinson because he hasn't fit in here. maybe, kicking tires on some guys. I mean, if a team goes and throws a ridiculous offer for a Besser or whatever, then you got to look at it. But we'll see. We'll see what happens in the next couple of days here.
Okay, I want to ask you about a couple of players that were sort of in the rumor mill. Some we now know are probably not going to be moved, but just the situations like JT Miller, for example. There was a lot of talk about JT Miller this season, probably dating all the way back to at least a couple months ago. And then it was pulled sort of back that Vancouver was thinking about re-signing him and they didn't really want to trade him, but they were just seeing what the market would allow. Did you ever think that JT Miller was going to go anywhere?
Personally, I didn't think that those rumors are, I mean, the rumors come from somewhere, but the way he's played this year, he's been probably the Canucks' best player above everyone. Probably one of the best players in the NHL. I don't think, maybe there was some talk about at the beginning, but as he started playing and the management started seeing what type of importance he was to the Canucks, I mean, I think those talks went away. And the thing is, now if you are going to trade him, you want a ridiculous package for the guy. I mean, and probably something that no team is going to want to pay. So I don't think he's going anywhere. I think he's a big core piece of the Canucks. Yes, he's 29 years old, but you look at what the Sedins did until they were 35. I mean, I think Miller's best days are still ahead of him. I think he can be a solid contributor to the Canucks for the next 4 or 5 years. So I don't think he's over the hill. I think he's a Canuck with an extension, personally.
Okay, what about Brock Besser? Like, here's a guy that we believe was probably going to be part of the Vancouver Canucks' long-term future plans, but that narrative may have changed a little bit. Do you believe he's a guy that they're actively really looking to move? Is he a guy that isn't part of their long-term plans anymore? And if he's not moved by the deadline, do you still think that he could be moved?
Besser's an interesting case to me. I think because he's on that restricted free agent this offseason, he's got a big qualifying offer. I think they want to re-sign him, but the money may not work. I mean, there's just so many contracts that they got that Rutherford has been strapped with the, coming into this team, and he's got to move out money. I mean, he's got to move out something. And Connor Garland's a candidate. That's why he's been in there to get out some money. Besser could be gone because they just can't afford him. And that's just the bottom line, especially if they want to re-sign JT Miller to that, $8-9 million, which is probably what he's going to command since Hurdle's contract screwed everything up.
Yeah. So the forward lines the forwards that we heard out there, big names, probably aren't really going to be the guys we watch, because they're still like Claude Giroux. There's still a lot of guys out in the market that are the big names that everybody's sort of watching. And Vancouver's guys, Miller, obviously out of that conversation now. He would have been in that tier of big name people. I'm not sure if Brock Besser qualifies. Maybe he's second tier, maybe that sort of thing. But on the blue line, there's some guys that we are sort of watching for. I mean, you mentioned Tyler Myers. Luke Schen's been a name that's been thrown out there a little bit. Do you believe that Vancouver's maybe looking to move somebody from there? Is it clearing out money for Myers? Is it actually getting a better return for Schenn because maybe a team is willing to overpay a little bit for a guy like him? What are you thinking there?
Well, I mean, I mentioned Tyler Myers, and his contract is so big, and to move that type of money, especially at the deadline, is just, I don't think a team's going to want. He's still got term on his contract too, which is not ideal for teams to bring on. And he's been a really good, despite what some people say about Myers, he's actually been a really good defenseman for the Canucks this year. I mean, he still has those those turnovers you don't like, but he's played the third most minutes of any defenseman. He's a key part of the team. Unless you're getting something in return for him that's going to take on that role, the Canucks are taking a step back. So, I mean, ideally you want to move that money out, but maybe in the offseason, not now. Luke Schenn is another interesting case. He's also has term. He's got one more year after this. So he was signed to a 2-year contract in the free agency. So yes, he'd be a great piece to any team because of the fact that he's won 2 cups. He was a pretty good player for Tampa in those 2 cup runs as well. So, and he's been really good for the Canucks because of, injuries, and Pullman been out and Hamonic was out at the beginning of the season. He's solidified himself as being a top 4 defenseman now for the Canucks. And he's probably one of the most physical defensemen they have too. So that'd be a big loss losing him. But I think, yeah, like you said, I think a team would overpay for him if they did put him on the market for sure.
Am I fair to say that Vancouver is probably a lot of talk and little action? Is that where we're going to classify them heading into the deadline on Monday?
Like the Canucks are always every year. There's so much talk before it, and they just never do anything unless a small trade like they did with, a Sven Baracchini type thing, these small little depth moves that probably won't do anything now, but may do something in the future. But yeah, I think it's going to be maybe some small moves. I'd be surprised if they did anything massive.
Well, it'll be interesting to watch anyway. We got a few days to find out if that's true or not. Austin is with us for Los Angeles. He covers the Kings for the Hockey Raiders. Austin, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, let people know where they can find you. Are you working on anything specific? The Kings are an interesting team. I think they're better than everybody figured they would be coming into the season. 74 points. They're right in the playoff mix. What's happening out of Los Angeles there?
Yeah, like you said, Austin Stanovich, I cover the Kings. If you want to find me on Twitter, it's Stanovich68. And like you said, they've surprised a lot of people, even myself. I had them as a playoff team coming into the year, but I thought they'd sneak in the wild card spot or kind of the third best team in the Pacific, but they've exceeded that expectation, sitting second right now. They've gotten a little help. I think Edmonton and especially Vegas really struggling, which surprised a lot of people, has helped them a lot, but they look really good. Working on right now, the Kings have been decimated by injuries in the last couple of weeks. They're getting a little help tonight with Alex Edler coming back, but that's one of their starting 6 defensemen from opening night. So they are getting killed in the back end right now, and that's kind of driven a lot of the trade talk around them right now is, can they go out and get someone to help bridge the gap between now and when they get those guys back? I personally don't see a lot happening with the Kings coming into Monday, just because they're in this awkward in-between stage where they're not ready to really make a cup run and go out and get someone who's going to push them over the edge, but they're also out of the stage where they're looking to trade some of their veteran guys to get future assets. So kind of like Vancouver, I would expect there not to be too much movement. There's maybe going to be a couple depth guys they bring in, but outside of that, I wouldn't expect much.
I don't know the Kings situation, obviously, as well as you do. Are they in a situation with their injuries where they can take advantage of LTIR, or are there most of their guys not in that situation where they expect them to return before the playoffs, so they can't take advantage of that money, or wouldn't anyway?
They're not really in a spot to take advantage of that. Their only guy on LTIR right now is Sean Walker, who gives you about $2.5 million, not much to play with. And they don't have another guy who they can put on there. They had Alex Edler, but again, he's coming back tonight, so they can't really take advantage of that.
Is there anything that you expect if they're going to be quiet for the deadline? What do you think that their maybe not short-term, midterm, long-term planning is? Like where do the Kings sit? Pleasantly surprised, we'll make a run if we can make a run this year, but what happens now after this is over in the offseason long-term for the Kings?
So all the reporting coming out of the Kings is saying they are going to look to make a really big splash this summer. It sounds like they're going to go hard for a top 6 goal scorer. They've been the worst finishing team in the league, and they need a lot of help in that department, and they need a lot of the help on the power play. They have one of the worst power plays in the league, so that's definitely something they're going to go after. And it's been a full year now that we've heard they're looking for a dynamic young offensive defenseman to help on the left side. So the rumors are coming in that they're going to go hard after someone in that mold. Jacob Chychrun's been the big name. Obviously, that's not going to happen before Monday. I don't think the Ben Chirot deal, I think, killed any hope of that happening. I mean, if that's what Ben Chirot goes for, I don't even want to imagine what Jacob Chychrun's going to bring in. So I would expect coming into the draft and maybe even into next year's deadline, you'll see some big moves from the Kings to try and push themselves to that next level, but it's going to be at that time. I actually think an interesting thing to look forward to with the Kings is, do they try and go really hard to win a cup while they sub Andre Kopitar, Drew Doughty, and even Jonathan Quick playing pretty well right now? I think that's going to be a big thing the next year.
Do you expect any of the guys they have on their current roster? I mean, when you're in a playoff position like this and you don't really want to be selling, but they got Edler, they got Mata, they got some of these guys being UFAs. Is there any chance that any of these guys move, or they just hang on to them and they take their chances with them in the offseason?
Mata, they maybe move. I think it'd be hard to find a buyer for him. He's been better recently, but he's had a pretty tough time with the Kings. I don't think there's any real urgency to trade those guys. I think they're fine holding on to them and just letting them walk. Honestly, they have such a deep prospect pool that they don't need to worry about, hey, if we lose this guy, we can't replace him or it's going to be expensive. They can just let a prospect come in and fill in for him. One guy I would have said coming to the deadline, this is a guy they might move out. Maybe they can get a couple assets for him, is Andreas Athanasiou. He was playing really well. He's hurt now. He's going to be hurt to the deadline. I can't imagine you find a buyer for him. So that's kind of off the board now.
Yeah, that was definitely somebody I'm familiar with. We had Athanasiou for a little bit in Edmonton, didn't really do much. He was supposed to be one of those guys that, helped them get into the playoff hunt, and it didn't really pan out and wound up being a disaster for the Oilers. Not that it was Athanasiou's fault, but yeah, he's a guy that he's always sort of on that radar in the background there, right? Like, can somebody add him? Can they get him to score a couple goals in a playoff run? Be interesting to keep our eyes on the King, though. I think they're a team definitely to watch. You're right. When they've got these young prospects and these good players coming up, how they mix that team together will be very interesting. Whether or not they do that at the trade deadline, I have no idea if this is going to be something that they start to tackle now or if they wait until after, but they'll be an interesting team to watch for sure. Let's switch gears over to Victor. Victor covers the San Jose Sharks for the Hockey Writers, also does a fantasy show, all sorts of fun stuff. Victor, how are you? I hope everything's going well. What are you covering with the Sharks? Where can they find you? Are you working on anything specific towards the deadline? I mean, you guys just had some big news coming out of San Jose.
We sure did, yeah. Mike, you can find me at Victor Nuno 12, VICTORNUNO 12 on my Twitter. And as Jim has been on the show and Matt as well, the Fantasy Hockey Life is a podcast that the Hockey Writers supports as well. And I wrote actually a big piece on the trade deadline history. So going back at all the moves the Sharks had made. Also made my case for why the Sharks should tear it down and do a full rebuild, which they are obviously not going to do, especially with the Hurdle news. My colleague, Josh Frogelin, wrote about the Hurdle signing today, actually, so you can check that out, which I retweeted as well. That's obviously the big news, and I think that is kind of the big news going forward, is that in my mind, the Sharks refuse to realize that their core is aged and no longer really a contender, but they keep wanting to push their chips in and think they can retool and go back at it. And I just don't see it. And it's kind of frustrating to watch, frankly.
So we know how you feel about the Thomas Hurdle signing. It seems pretty obvious, but what were you thinking in terms of what they could have potentially done with a trade? Did you think that he was one of those guys that could be moved? And did you think that the return that San Jose could have got had they chosen to move him would have really set that team on the right path that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's tough to say what was out there. I think that, yes, I was in favor of trading any assets you can and rebuilding. And Hurdle was obviously the best. He's a very good player. And not to discount his quality at all, because he's a really good player. It's just that, paying 8 times 8+ for a guy who's older and could have got you. Yeah, I don't know what we could have got. It seems like the Sharks could have gotten a pretty good prospect, a good pick at least. It depends on whether it was a sign and trade or just a rental. A rental probably would have gotten a lot less. And I think that that's maybe what they were afraid of. I think they could have done a rental and maybe had him re-sign in the offseason. That would have been interesting. At least they could have got some assets for it, because clearly the Sharks still believe they can make the playoffs. I think they're delusional. But the team still believes, and they want to push for it this season and beyond.
So based on that thinking, if the San Jose Sharks believe that they are a better team than maybe they appear to be, or that a lot of people think they are and need to retool, but they're not going to do that, what do they do here at the deadline? Are they moving anybody? Are they selling anything? Are they hanging on to all these people because they believe they have a solid team and everybody on this roster is going to be useful at some point? Like, what do you think their mentality is, and how do they approach the next few days here?
Well, I look at what they did in the previous seasons when they clearly were a worse team than they are now. I think this iteration of the teams that have missed the playoffs in the last few seasons, at least has a little bit more fight in them. They're in more games. They're not getting blown out every night. They still can't score or keep the puck out very well, but they're a little bit more competitive, especially when Reimer's in net. I think they might do some things like what they did when they acquired Jonathan Dahlin, Alexander Barabanov, some little trades like that might net them someone that they can give an opportunity to, and maybe they can flourish or at least show a little bit. Maybe garner some assets with picks. I don't know that they're going to want to trade someone like Jacob Middleton, who's been a bit of a revelation for them. He's very physical and played really well up and down the different pairings. And so he's someone they might hang on to. I'm curious to see what they do with Barabanov. He clearly wants to stay. He's said that. But, I don't think he's a first line player on a good team. So it seems like the Sharks could get, a decent asset. And I just don't know that he fits into what they want to do long term. Like, is he really going to be a top 6 winger for them? He's a UFA. He showed really well. He'd fit really well on a competitor on a third or second line to add some scoring punch. So it seems like a team could possibly overpay, and the Sharks could take advantage of that.
I was going to ask you about Middleton. There's been a lot of talk about him and what the San Jose Sharks might get for him. He seems to have sort of come out of nowhere, signed an AHL deal, is playing really well, playing top 4 minutes. Is attractive to a lot of teams, especially at that salary. What would it take for San Jose to move him, do you think?
Yeah, he's a playoff type defenseman. He's exactly what a competitor should want. And I think that it would have to be an offer that they feel like they couldn't refuse. So maybe like a middle to high end prospect, or maybe a second round pick and a middle prospect. I think that might do it. I mean, he is older. That's the thing that I would consider if I were the Sharks. He's a bit older. And he's an RFA, right? So how much of a raise is he going to get? Is this a Scheig situation all over again, who looked really good for one season and then they signed him for a bit of term and he hasn't ever really looked the same? Of course, he had a knee injury, but Middleton plays that type of style, that rough and tumble style that may, get him injured, and maybe he doesn't able to produce like he is now. So that would be my concern. But it seems like they really like him. I think though, if a pretty decent offer came along, they would ship him out, especially considering people forget that Nikolai Knyzhov hasn't played all season and he was fantastic last season. So can he repeat what he did? Can Scheig return to some bit of a form? And obviously Ferraro has been, really emerged as a top pairing guy there. So it seems like they shouldn't really need him, but they want to keep him, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but you raise a good point, though. I mean, if he turns into a fantastic player that is going to be on your team and in the top 4 for a long time, then you would be kicking yourself if you moved him. But if this is the 1 year where he plays the way he's played and doesn't ever do it again, and then you didn't move him and you could have got something, it's a tough spot to be in. And there's some teams that are facing this, but yeah, Middleton's one of those guys. All right. So my consensus here from all three of us is that all of these teams are probably not going to be terribly active. I hate to be boring radio, but I have a feeling the Edmonton Oilers are probably in the same boat. There's a lot of talk surrounding the Oilers. They need a goaltender. They could use an extra defenseman. I think their forward group is set now. The guys are coming back healthy. The only one they're missing is Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, but Puljujärvi comes back into the lineup tonight. They play Buffalo. Chris Russell's coming back off of long-term injury reserve. So they have a decent mix. I think their goaltending is still a massive question, but I don't believe that they're going to be doing anything about that. Ken Holland says he's not giving up a first. He's not giving up a second or a third. He's not moving any high-end picks. He's not really trading anybody off the roster. So I don't know what you can get on the goaltending market that's already pretty dry. And Marc-Andre Fleury is like your big get. You're certainly not getting him for a 4th-round pick. So I don't imagine that the Oilers are going to be doing a whole lot. So unfortunately, I have to say that we're probably all with teams that are not going to be extremely active. That said, this might be the most fun part of this conversation in this segment for the Pacific Division is us looking at other teams. So there are some teams in this division that have already been a little bit active that could be active again. I'll start with Matthew. Do you have a team that you're kind of keeping your eyes open for that you're thinking it might be the team to watch here over the next few days out of this Pacific Division specifically?
Well, I mentioned it in the other divisions about Vegas, and that's a team I'm kind of looking at because of the fact of how much they've struggled in the last, they're on a 5-game losing streak. They're falling out of the playoffs fast. I mean, they're only a point up on Vancouver now. Their goaltending now, Leonard's out for a while. They're going to have to get some goaltending unless they want to have Brossoit be the guy going to the stretch into the playoffs, because I don't know if that's the best scenario for them. I think Vegas is going to be interesting to see what they can, if they look at kick tires on goaltenders, because they're going to be desperate for them, because with the team they've got added Jack Eichel, they're really loaded on offense and defense. It's their goaltending that's going to be a problem, and it's been a problem. So I think Vegas is going to be the one team to watch. Calgary's already made a couple moves. I don't know if they're going to be making any more. So yeah, Vegas is for me is the one to look at.
Let me ask you this. My impression of Vegas is that they build a team in a very interesting and I don't know, ideal way. If they don't make the playoffs this season, do you think it changes their perspective on how they construct their roster moving forward? Because this is a team that has bought from day one. They have spent countless dollars to grab every player that is a big name, and they've moved out big players for the newest flavor of the month. Yeah. And they do it over and over and over again. And these guys are cup or bust. So if they don't make the playoffs, does it change their way of approaching how they build this roster, do you think?
Well, I mean, yeah, like you said, they're an interesting team. The way they work and do business, it's, they kind of circumvent the cap, even though they're not circumventing the cap. They're able to add players. Like, I didn't think they would be able to add a guy like Jack Eichel, but they did it. And getting Pietrangelo, but they got rid of a guy to get him in. I mean, it's an interesting. They don't seem to have a lot of loyalty to players. I don't know. It's an interesting way of doing business, and I think it may change if they don't make the playoffs, because that's the first time it's not worked. So I think it'll be interesting to watch, not just now, but after this season, depending on what happens with them.
Yeah, I gotta say, like, after that first season, and they've ditched most of the guys that helped them get to that cup run in the first, like, then there's no loyalty there. I'm kind of like, I get a little sour on Vegas in the way that they build their team now. Austin, what about you? Is there a team in the Pacific Division outside of Los Angeles that you're kind of keenly keeping an eye on here?
Yeah, Vegas definitely would have been there. The team I'm really keeping an eye on, though, is just down the freeway, the Anaheim Ducks. They've got some big pieces. They already moved Josh Manson out, and the big name coming from them is going to be Hampus Lindholm. I already mentioned the Trot trade, but I don't think anyone outside of Montreal was happier for that trade to go through than the Ducks, because that just jacked the price of Hampus Lindholm up so much. Cervelli reported today they're looking for a first-round pick, A-level prospect, and an extra asset, and it's not unrealistic to think they could get that based on what the market is set at right now. And if they get that, I mean, the rich get richer for their prospect pool. And then they've got other guys. Ricard Raquel's another piece that could get them something pretty good. I don't think it'll be quite the same kind of return. I think there's going to be a team, though, that maybe misses out on a Claude Giroux and panics and goes out and overpays for Ricard Raquel. And then also looking at some of their depth guys, Nick Delorier, he's not going to fetch you much, but he might get you something. And then there's a report today that Max Comtois might be available from them. And I think that's a guy who could also get you a big, big return. If I was a Ducks fan, I heard that they're shopping Comtois, I'd be pretty livid, because I think that's a great player. But if you're a team looking for a playoff type forward, that's a guy I'd really want. Big, fast, can score goals. So they're the big team I'm looking for from the Pacific right now.
We've seen it with Montreal that they've had a high asking price for a lot of their players, and they've been sticking to their guns on that. Do you think Anaheim does the same? Do you think that they have said, you know what, this is what we want from Lindholm. If we don't get it, we're not moving them. Same thing with Raquel, things like that. Do they stick to that high asking price, or do you think they're a team that just actively look at a sell, pick up what they can, and move forward?
I think they'll probably drop a little bit on the Lindholm price. I don't think anyone's going to pay quite that much. I think they'll probably get a first round pick, maybe a B prospect and like a depth player, but even then that's a great return for them. I was listening to the Athletic Hockey podcast, and they're talking about with Trot, basically, if you keep saying that he's worth a first round pick, someone's eventually probably going to pay a first round pick. And I think that's kind of what the Ducks are going for with Lindholm. If they keep telling everyone this is what this guy's worth, eventually someone's just going to believe it, and they're going to make the trade. We saw it work with Montreal, like you said, and I think they're going to try and do the same thing. I don't think it'll work quite as well for Lindholm, because he wants an absolutely monster contract at the end of the year. It sounds like he wants kind of like a hurdle 8x8 kind of thing, and I'm just not sure teams are going to give up a huge haul for him and then also re-sign him for that kind of deal. So I think it'll come down a little bit, but they'll get a first round pick for him and a good prospect at minimum.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch what happens with him, because if Chikrin's off the board, which we assume that he is, Lindholm might be the defenseman to watch here now. Victor, what about you? Is there a team outside of San Jose? We've kind of covered Vegas pretty well. Austin just ran into the Ducks, the team you're watching.
Well, I guess I'll go Seattle. No, I think Seattle is an interesting place as well. I probably would have said Vegas too, like Matt, just because they're falling out and maybe they could move some cap around and not necessarily throw in the towel, but get some assets back for some guys like Riley Smith. But let's talk about Seattle, because they have a ton of cap space and they are clearly a bad team. So they don't have any delusions of making the playoffs or even necessarily being competitive in the next year or two. It seems like they've realized they need to collect assets, draft, and, have some young players. They also don't have any huge contracts. I mean, their biggest contract is their goalie, Philip Grubauer, who obviously has struggled, but has also shown that he can be good in front of a good defense, which he doesn't have. So, I could see some pretty good players going out. We already saw Young Croak go, and we could easily see some other decent roster players be moved out that don't have a super high cap hit and could really help, someone like a Giordano. Obviously he's a bit older, and they are obviously willing to retain salary, as they should. They could get some really nice assets, and there aren't a whole lot of teams that are in that position that can retain money and are clearly out of the playoff picture and can give some pretty decent players that have playoff experience. All the guys on their roster clearly don't have experience in Seattle, but most of them have had playoff experience elsewhere. And so that could be really valuable for another team. And so I could see them being pretty active. They already have a decent number of picks in the next couple drafts, and I could see them just loading up on several more and building this through the draft.
Yeah, they are going to be an interesting team because they are willing to sell. They're willing to retain salary. They're willing to sign and go for probably some players in the offseason that maybe some other teams won't be in on because the asking price is going to be way too high from their agents and whatever. So Seattle's going to be a really interesting team to watch because I think they thought they had somewhat of a plan going in. That plan didn't really work too well. Their goaltending situation is going to be interesting. I don't know if they're going to keep both guys, so we'll see. I guess the downside of me going last here is that I get to pick up the pieces here. I'll go with Calgary. I am curious to see what they do. Matthew, I think you said it, that they probably are done because of their cap hit situation, and they've already made a couple moves, adding Tyler Toffoli, and then getting Yarncroc and stuff. But I'm curious. I mentioned it earlier in one of the segments that Sean Monahan's name is out there, and I'm very kind of curious to see if that happens. I don't know that it'll happen before Monday, but that tells me that if they're shopping him around, that they are looking to make one more splash. And I don't know what it is. I'm not sure if they're looking to add a defenseman or bring Giordano back or whatever they're thinking about doing, that if they require moving Monahan out to make that move, that Tree Living's not done. Whatever, he might be finished, but he doesn't want to be finished, right? Like that's what I'm getting the sense out of Calgary, is that they were going for it. I will fully admit I was way wrong on Calgary at the beginning of the year. I did not think they would be this good. They were a good team, and they got better with the additions that they made, and they are going to make a run, and they're going to push hard to do whatever they can do to add to this team and try to get better. So it'll be interesting for me if they have the ability to move some pieces out to make that one more move. I think they're going to try, and I don't know if they'll be able to pull it off because it's going to be hard to move cap around and stuff like that. But if they can find a taker for Monahan, then it should be interesting to see what they do. Because the second that trade goes down, if it goes down, just watch. There's going to be a big splash coming out of Calgary, right? So it'll be very, very interesting. All right, that's going to cut her off for the show, guys. This was our final division. I appreciate you coming in to talk the Pacific Division. This covers the entire 2022 NHL Trade Deadline. I've told everybody on the other segments that if you guys are up for it and we have your teams do some major moves here or make some major transactions, that we might bring you back afterwards to sort of talk about what happened and dissect them a little bit. So hopefully you guys are open to doing that. But for Matthew and Victor and Austin and myself, and by the way, you can check me out on Twitter at NHL_Trade Talk, because I love talking trades and rumors. That's what we do. So you're welcome to find me there. But thank you to all three of you, to everybody else who joined us on the show. For those of you that are watching, this was a precursor, hopefully, to a lot of action for the 2022 NHL Trade Deadline. For the Hockey Raiders, have a fantastic one. Enjoy the trade deadline, and we'll talk to you after it's over.